All right. Okay, thank you so much. Can we begin?
Sure. Should I stand? Sit,
However you want.
lay down?
Yeah, so like you don't have a PowerPoint, right? So-
No, I don't.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing screen then and just.
It's okay, we can just leave it up. Or, yeah.
Just so it's not distracting. All right. I'll log on. You guys can start. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this year's Ethnic Studies Undergraduate Symposium. We're excited to have you. Thank you. We're really grateful that you guys took the time to be here and to celebrate the work of our students. Before we begin, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are currently residing on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. The Kumeyaay people are the original inhabitants of the lands that UCSD occupies, and they continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions. Okay, so today we have four amazing presenters: Willie Q, Catherine Duran, Helen Zhu, and Paige Love. Thank you guys for being here. So we are going to hold Q&A until the end of all the presentations. So if you have questions, please take note of them and just hold them until the end. And I also want to remind any of the graduating seniors that are here that you should make your way to the Hopkins Bridge at 4:15 p.m. Cool. So our first presenter today is Willie Q. Willie is in his fourth year and graduating as a member of UCSD's class of 2022 with a double major in mathematics, economics, and ethnic studies. Being a first-generation Chinese-American student from San Francisco, his project reflects his desire to return to the Bay Area in the future to work and bring positive, informed change to his community, using lessons from ethnic studies to address racial, social, and economic inequalities. William emphasized a big thanks to the Ethnic Studies Department and the many professors and TAs that sparked and held his passion for ethnic studies from the day he first stepped into the ethnic studies class. He wouldn't be here if not for their support and for his education and their own passion for this invaluable work. Cool, please help me in welcoming Willie.
Hi, y'all. I don't have a visual, so we'll just have this really nice background. But yeah. So to start, the title of my research paper is Social Antibodies, and it's about how Chinese American communities responded to COVID-era racializations. So stepping into this project, my question was looking at how the framing of China as a threat to national security and paradoxically as a valuable source of economy and labor for consumption in the American imaginary impact the Chinese American community and our identity formations. So I'll start with my positionality and a bit about like my methodology. So being part of the Chinese American community and from the San Francisco Bay Area, hate crimes have shot up exponentially since the beginning of COVID. And I found this deeply relevant to me because I am Chinese American and I'm from the Bay Area. And I primarily use three types of sources for analysis in my papers, which were news articles, tweets, and other social media, and organizational websites. And I was heavily influenced by Professors Eve Tuck and Kei-Wen Yang's research on writings on damage-centered research. So in my paper, I deviate from like researching the harms and effects of racism and rather focus on the community's response to it. And I also specifically seek to distinguish between Chinese American community and like the Asian American community as a whole because they get conflated as a monolithic group for too long. And in my presentation as well as my paper, I deliberately separate the usage. And when I say Chinese American, I'm specifically talking about the Chinese American community versus when I say Asian American, I'm talking about Asian Americans as a whole. So a little bit of context as well as the cause for COVID-era racialization. So when we talk about anti-Asian sentiment in the United States, and sometimes even in ethnic studies, as well as the traditional sense, there's a focus on specific watershed movements or moments and kind of like a lack of everything in between. So when you think about anti-Asian racism, you think about like Japanese internment, Chinese exclusion, and it kind of erases like the periods in between when anti-Asian racism does still exist. And I won't get into a lot of the details there. There's a lot to explore, but specifically for the context of this paper, it's important to look at the creation of the Yellow Peril, which frames China or Chinese people as a threat of taking over the Western world. And some examples are communism, as well as after China opened up to the Western world, like the environmental impacts of Chinese industrialism. And then also the formation of the model minority, and as well as the repeated framing of Chinese bodies as disease. So for this part, we have the bubonic plagues of 1899 and 1904 that led to the closing of Honolulu and San Francisco's Chinatown, as well as the opium epidemics of the 1800s that were actually caused by the West and Europe. More recently, there's been the H1N1 bird flu epidemic that led to the framing of Chinese people as disease. So the point is that the view of China as a threat has never really disappeared. It's just changed in its form in how people view, what is essentially a threat to the stabilization of the free world. So in terms of COVID era, the simplest spark is the label of COVID-19 as a Chinese China or Wuhan virus. And there's a lot of problems with this about attaching a geographical location to diseases. And this isn't limited to COVID-19 alone. It kind of essentializes the geographic location as like a disease producing space. So a deeper connection is the relation of COVID to Chinese food culture. So in this, we see like the reemergence of exoticism and the deviance of Chinese, Asian, and generally just non-Western foods. So there's been a lot of narratives that Chinese people eat bats or like just non-Western meats essentially, and when in fact like a lot of these foods are just not normalized in Western diets, and in fact Western diets also contain a lot of like wildlife foods such as cow testicles, alligators, or even snakes themselves. And so while Chinese consumption is seen as like virus producing because they're like these different and not normative foods, American consumption of wildlife and exotic meats is often actually seen as like luxurious or in some cases kind of weird, but like progressive in the way like it deviates from like eating factory farmed meats. So another prominent narrative about the food culture is the calling for bans against wet markets. So to clarify what wet markets are, they're kind of just like open air markets. Think of like farmers markets or stuff that's similar, selling general produce, like daily necessities, and like just meat in general, like normal meats in general. And it oftentimes serves as a place of interaction, community bonding, between customers and vendors, rather than like the supermarket transactional relationship that we have in the United States and Europe. So rather than reporting on like what markets really are and like the importance of them to Chinese culture, as well as many different cultures around the world that are like wet markets are really common in a lot of like Asian countries as well, other Asian countries as well. The Western media, as well as a lot of politicians, framed wet markets as places that are unhygienic or medieval, like backwards, and they called for the closing down of what is essentially a very important source of accessible food for a lot of these communities, especially given that supermarkets aren't as common in China and other countries as they are in the West. So the most dangerous out of all of these framings is the conspiracy theories about how China produced the vaccine, or it produced the virus in a lab and then essentially leaked it as a weapon against the West and United States. So this directly implicates China as a threat to the world, and it frames Chinese people as not just a carrier of disease like the previous points, but rather specifically like agents of destabilization. And it kind of calls back to the spy agent era of communism in the late 1900s. So even as American intelligence directly disproved this theory, both Trump and Biden have opened up investigations into this lab leak theory, which prompted actually a majority of Americans to believe that COVID-19 originated in the lab. So this just recalls to the imagery of Chinese people as a body of threatening and disease-carrying horde, back to how the Yellow Peril has been framing Chinese people for like over 100 years now. And the effect of this is, I'll just go over this really quickly. There's been a large rise in hate crimes, harassment, and violence and killings of Chinese and Asian Americans. And we can look more into detail. There's a really good project called Stop AAPI Hate that collects a lot of data on this. And there's also been a disproportionate effect on Chinatown businesses who have been framed as disease spaces. And it turns away people who would normally visit these businesses. And these statistics are likely also underreported because official data collected by governmental agencies might lack responses from Chinese American communities. So the bulk of my project was looking at the community responses. The first part is kind of like a general acknowledgement of the racism that's been occurring. This isn't really like a solution, but it does help that it's getting more people educated, especially people within the Chinese American community that weren't aware of the history of anti-Asian racism. There's also been a lot of a rise in anti-Blackness inside the community as well because of the trope of Black and Asian conflict due to the impact of crime and violence on the Chinese American community. So there's also been an emphasis of media, both mainstream and Chinese American media, that kind of just shows or emphasizes Black and Asian crime rather than crime or harassment in general, which causes harmful effects such as racial profiling and increases bias against Black communities. So the large portion of my paper is about the self-determination of Chinese American communities. So there's been a lot of Chinatown support funds that pools community resources to help the most vulnerable businesses and individuals, which are generally first generation Chinese and are non-English speaking. So these people have difficulty accessing normal, traditional resources from the government or from nonprofit organizations. And these community organized funds are able to reach them in a way that these governmental grants or nonprofit organizations aren't, because they have a cultural connection with the community, as well as just a general allows for sorry, I just lost my chain of thought. But kind of it crosses the language barrier that's existent in a lot of these connections. So one of these response initiatives is the emergence of safety patrols in the Bay Area specifically. And I think this was pretty special because it consisted of volunteers both inside and outside of the community. And because of the safety patrols, there was a recognition that police weren't the end-all solution to violence and crime, especially because volunteers are able to de-escalate situations and facilitate dialogue in ways that police oftentimes aren't able to. And it also creates stronger ties with the community because they interact on a more personal basis rather than the power hierarchy between community members and police. And as seen above, other communities have also come to Chinese and Asian American people in their time of need. And anti-Asian racism has increased Chinese Americans' awareness of discrimination for other communities of color, and have fostered commonality and understanding about the struggles of other people of color. And we can see this during the 2020-2021 rallies of the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as projects like Letters for Black Lives. So these movements between and within the Chinese American communities and other communities in the United States conveys a sense of interdependency and reduced reliance on structures of power and governmental systems. And it also shows the possibility of solidarity through increased understanding that problems that affect our communities or my community also affects other communities and they're not isolated. So there's a lot of disproportionate harms that affect both communities at once, where we can see how we can address them together rather than separately. And I hope that this paper can show us the possibility of moving forward of solidarity with other social movements and possibilities from community-based organizing and self-determination and community interdependence.
Thank you so much, Willie. I'll remind you again, if you have questions, please take note of them for the Q&A at the end. Okay. Our second presenter is Catherine Duran.
Damn, Loki, can I stand?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't even know what. Okay.
Okay, let me just. I'm sorry.
No, you
I don't know how to use it.
shouldn't.
Okay, our second presenter is Catherine Zaran. They are one of our graduating seniors this year. Okay, she is proud to be a low-income brown Mexican queer first-generation graduate born and raised in Logan Heights, one of the historically Latinx communities in San Diego. It was through their community and the sacred space of the Ethnic Studies Department that Catherine was able to come to feel empowered in all of their identities. Catherine is hoping to honor their diploma by showing up for their community and for the liberation of all marginalized people in all aspects of their lives. Currently, she has many goals set on higher education, but is excited to explore all of her many passions for social justice at some point. Please help me in welcoming Kathy.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Kathy. My presentation is called Ethnic Studies at UCSD, a Center for Student Activism and University Abolition. So the big question that I'm following through my project is, in what way does the Ethnic Studies Department support and stimulate student activism and university abolition, and why does this matter? So I kind of want to unpack what that actually means and kind of the rationale behind my project. So I am actually very much anti-research. As someone who really grew up in communities where people are coming in and wanting to research, learn more about our suffering and stuff, a lot of the times what ends up happening is that this research ends up compiled somewhere where we can't access it. I remember really vividly coming from high school, and I live in Logan Heights. I'm surrounded by low income Mexican people all the time and stuff, but I had no idea about all the environmental racism that was happening in my community. And then I came to UCSD, and one of my first classes talked about that. And I thought that was a really insane experience, right? Because how is it that people in these communities aren't actually getting access to this information? What is our purpose as academics if all we're doing is sitting over here at the top of the hill and having these conversations and not actually going and implementing things. So I think one of the biggest goals for my research and my project was to have something at the end of it that was generative, that didn't conform to, having to do the whole research paper and having that be my goal. Really the grade for this class and this paper wasn't my main goal. I really wanted to have something that I could bring out into the community, even if it was something small. Obviously, there's only 10 weeks. So I really have been passionate about the Ethnic Studies Department ever since I joined it. I came in as a poli-sci major, and it was a very white dominated and male dominated department that I felt very constantly excluded from. But because I am a hard-working brown woman, I was like, no, I'm just gonna stick with it. And then I took my first ethnic studies class, and it was over. And then I found out that one of my favorite mentors is was also an ethnic studies major. So for me, it was an easy decision to pick that up too. But based on that, I noticed that a lot of people in high school, we don't know what ethnic studies actually is. And I really like to run my mouth on Twitter. I think that running my mouth is one of the best ways that I'm able to really impact other people and stuff, because that's how you get people thinking. So one day I hopped on Twitter and I was like, if you're a poli-sci major and you did it because you want to enact change, be an ethnic studies major. And it blew up, it went viral, and I had a bunch of people in my DMs asking me what's ethnic studies, what is this, what's going on? And obviously, I am a low-income brown student who was always bogged down by jobs and stuff, so I never got to really circle back around to that conversation. So I thought that my project would be the perfect opportunity to do that, because I think that the ethnic studies department does stimulate a lot of student activism on this campus. Even if it's like directly and indirectly, like I know that we in like our ethnic studies cohort, like we share space with a lot of student activists, a lot of organizers, a lot of students that don't even think that they're activists and are activists. So I wanted to think about like how we could use like all that like knowledge and expertise that is already sitting in our department and somehow get that back to like high school students that like may not even know about ethnic studies, and ultimately like have ethnic studies like act in praxis, right? Because ethnic studies, like we really like try to strive for like social justice, try to strive for like dismantling institutions, but we are existing within one, right? So like this is an institution, and I think that the ethnic studies does a really good job of trying to like, you know, reject the institution in whatever ways it's possible. But I wanted to think about what are some more ways to do that. And honestly, I thought that the best way to do that was to convert some high school students into some ethnic studies majors, hopefully. So if you go to the next one. So yeah, so for my methodology for conducting my eventual research, which was a podcast, it was like an interview with an ethnic studies major who's also a student organizer. I was using two specific texts: Black Study, Black Struggle by Robin D.G. Kelly, and Towards a Critical Social Movement Study. So the reason why I picked both of these, one, Black Study, Black Struggle is like the #1 like reading in ethnic studies that has impacted me, because it basically like talks about like how we have to stop begging like the university to love us back. Like it's not going to do it. So the best thing that we can do is like steal from the university, steal the resources that it has, but like they're rightfully ours. I say steal, you know, to like really give it that like pizzazz, but like at the end of the day, like those resources are ours, right? And so like that, like reading really impacted me, especially like reading it in ethnic studies 100A in my 3rd year, when I was like really going through a lot of things in my personal life. Like there was like I really had to step up to the plate with some financial stuff. And I was in there like doing research over here, like hitting up the financial aid office, like hitting up everyone. Like I was gonna get my money, you know? So yeah, so I think that was really impactful. And that's what I really wanted to come into this with, like finding the best way for me to utilize this time that I have within the ethnic studies department to try to do as much community work, community adjacent work, generative work for my community. And then Towards a Critical Social Movement Studies, it's basically just a reading that talks about how research that is done about student activism should always be done to support that student activism. Like it can't be neutral. We can't show up and like analyze student activism and then take a step back, throw the paper down, and then keep it pushing, get your A. Like it should be something that is actually helping them, that is taking a stance. So those were two very, very, very important things to me as I went through with my project. So yeah, and then a little bit of ethnic studies and activism. They like pretty much exist very intersected. Ethnic studies like is rooted in activism, fuels activism. It's like a mutual circle, you know. So one of the things that I like really went into in research was the oh, now my voice really, hold on, let me take a breath. Yeah. So one of the things that I really researched was the Third World Strike at San Francisco State University, which was where like ethnic studies really was founded and stuff. Black students there, mostly Black students, were the ones who were like running all the like strikes, who were like getting people organized under political education, who were also facing the retaliation, right? So eventually we got the ethnic studies department, but like I think it's important to note that like in a lot of student activism, it's always like the students that are most at the margins who end up being like retaliated against, who end up being like taking the like really like the big like hit from like institutions or whatever when they want to make like a what's it called, like a demonstration of everyone, you know. And then thinking about that, I like also looked a lot into like Black Winter and the processes that are happening here on campus, specifically to show how UCSD is not a depoliticized like space like people try to make it out to be. There's student activists that are doing the work, but a lot of the times they get hidden. A lot of the times people that want to do the work don't know where to go. These places aren't visible. And like the person that I interviewed will definitely go more into that. So I will let those clips run in a bit. So yeah, just again, reiterating the question that I wanted to pinpoint with this like podcast is how can the ethnic studies department continue to stimulate student activism and create a safe space for students to engage in the student activism? And how can we balance the contradictions of being in the university and abolishing it as well? So yeah, so I'm about to play some clips from my interview with Sara Guzman. She is a very close friend of mine. She's an ethnic studies and poli-sci double major, also graduating, and they're a member of UCSD United Students Against Sweatshops. And some of the questions that I brought up to her were like, how was being an ethnic studies major shaped or informed her organizing efforts? Some of the things that she would say to high schoolers who were considering ethnic studies, and also what she would say to people who were considering like organizing and doing activism. So yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and play some of the like 3 quotes that I pulled out that I really like that Sara said, and then I can talk about the implications that I pulled from.
I realized I never used background, like history on.
Okay, yeah.
I realized
So I pulled out those 2 quotes to really show, one, to expose that there is student activism that's happening on this campus. I know that like Sara had shared that she was like a little bit hesitant to call herself an organizer, but she be organizing, you know? It's just that sometimes I feel like people don't want to say that like the work that they're doing is important. So I think that's one of the big things that I got from this project is that everything that we do, like in the name of social justice, in the name of liberation, is important. Like every conversation that we have. So with this podcast, I'm hopefully gonna get it like circulated out to high school students so they can get like a really vulnerable perspective about what's happening. You know, Sara said a lot of good things about the ethnic studies department or whatever. Some other things that I also wanted to keep in mind after I did this project was that I think that early outreach is really important. And I think it's going to become easier as like we see ethnic studies become a requirement in like high schools and become a requirement in like higher education. And mostly just that like having these one-to-one conversations are really like the best way to like get people in the know. You know, it's the best way to circulate information. So yeah, I'm hoping that like this podcast will be like one way to like get people more exposed to ethnic studies. and as a nice consequence, stimulates the student activism on this campus. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Ah. Okay, our next presenter is Helen. Hello, everyone. Helen is a fourth year. She's in her final year at UCSD studying human biology and ethnic studies. Her learning in ethnic studies has been a moving experience that has connected her to her peers, community, and her own identity. After graduating, she will be supporting a public health project at the iStrive lab to improve antiviral therapy adherence among women living with HIV and AIDS affected by adulthood interpersonal violence in California. Helen is passionate about reimagining healthcare as a compassionate, just system of support for communities, and she hopes to attend medical school in the future to pursue this vision. Please help me in welcoming Helen.
I'm gonna start my timer. Well, thank you for coming. So my project has nothing to do with my future career goals, but it is kind of an exploration of things that I've encountered in my own personal life. So my topic is Asian fishing and then the 2021 Atlanta spa shootings. And it's an analysis of gendered Asian diasporic discourses on the internet. There's just a trigger warning. I'll be talking about gun violence as well as sexual violence ahead. And then introduction. So the research questions that I addressed was number one, what is the relationship between the phenomena of Asian fishing and the 2021 Atlanta massage parlor shootings as examined through the online discourse of Asian diasporic women? And then in addition, what are the activist responses called for and or led by Asian diasporic women in response to these issues? I kind of came upon this question just through like sitting on TikTok at home during COVID with nothing left to do. And I noticed that with Asian fishing, which I'm going to go into more depth on what that is later, that there is a lot of like debate and discussion about like the minutia, like, is this person Asian fishing? And a lot of this conversation of like, does it really matter, right? Like, does one person's, makeup on the internet make a difference in the larger scheme of things? And like, as someone who identifies as Asian and also a woman, I had like that feeling like in my stomach, I was like, this doesn't feel right. And I really wanted to like use this research space to kind of engage with the broader structural questions and implications of what that is. So just to give some background on both of these topics. So Asian fishing is adapted from the term and concept of black fishing. And it's essentially when non-Asian individuals use cosmetic modifications. So this could be plastic surgeries, makeup, digital filters to make themselves appear more like East Asian. So whether that's like a monolid eye or a slanted eye, and just keep in mind that these features are not like, I guess, exclusive to East Asians, nor are they representative of East Asians. I'll go into that later. In combination with culturally appropriate costumery to perform stereotypical representations of Asianness, and especially representations of Asian femininity. And then the Atlanta spa shootings, they occurred on March 19th in 2021 in Atlanta, Georgia. And a man named Robert Long shot workers at 3 Asian-owned spas. And 8 people were killed in this incident. And 6 of those 8 people were Asian women who were working at these spas. So Xiao Jietan, Zhao Youfeng, Sun Chung Park, Hyun Chung Grant, Sun Cha Kim, and Yong Ayu are the Asian women whose lives were lost during these attacks. And I think temporally, these things are happening at the same time. So that's why I chose to kind of like look at the connections between the two, just because I wanted to answer that question of like, well, like, why does Asian fishing matter? Like, why does representation matter, and what material impact does it have on like the lives of Asian women? And then I drew upon 2 theories for my research. So the first one is about gendered Orientalism, and then the second one is US militarism. And in particular, I examined how these 2 concepts essentially like construct a certain figure and a certain representation of the Asian woman that is harmful. So gender Orientalism in the context of Asian women is the notion of the Orient as the culturally inferior other, converging with the notion of the woman as the gender inferior other. And this leads to Oriental archetypes of East and Southeast Asian women specifically. So like the lotus blossom baby is of like the innocent, submissive, childlike Asian woman. And then the dragon lady is like the hypersexual, temptation, like dangerous Asian woman. And these are both kind of, I guess, like fetishistic representations that are reproduced in media and have been reproduced in history as well. In addition, a really big part of Orientalism is this idea of like consumerism. So like consuming like Asian objects, Asian bodies, Asian sexuality and lives. And then the second topic is US militarism. So I focus in specific on the military sexual or the military prostitution complex, which is essentially like transnational institutionalized violence against East and Southeast Asian women because of like US military involvement in their countries. For example, like things like comfort stations were set up and women were coerced into becoming prostitutes at the risk of sexual violence and death. And essentially what US militarism does, especially in the context of Asian fishing and these shootings in the US, is that it reinforces the fetishization and the systems of control and representation over Asian women. So it reinforces kind of those like hypersexual, innocent, submissive archetypes that I've talked about previously. And then in particular for the setting of the Atlanta shootings, US militarism is inherently related to sex trafficking to massage parlors and the attachment of massage parlors as places of like, you know, sex work in a negative manner where these women are seen as like, dangerous and temptations to white men specifically. So I'm going to go into the methods of what I did for my research. So the parameters, essentially what I did is I collected, I think it ended up being like around like 60 different like tweets and TikTok posts talking about these two topics. Because there's like so much, I limited it to between the dates of March 16th, 2021, which is the day of the shooting, and then June 30th, 2021, just so I could really encompass like the fallout from what had tragically occurred. And then the keywords that I used to search, so for Asian fishing, just different versions of that. And then for the spa shootings, Atlanta spa shooting, massage parlor, Asian woman, etc. And then I specifically only looked at posts from self-identified Asian diasporic women. And then something that I noticed just during my research is that like, it was kind of hard to like find those posts, to be honest. There was a lot of conversation happening from non-Asian individuals, specifically like white folks about these topics, which is why like it really cemented like my focus on Asian diasporic women and their like, varied opinions specifically. And then in terms of methodology, there's a few different methodologies that I draw from, but I think the statement from Rachel Endo's article about these massage parlor shootings, and she identifies as an Asian American woman as well, and that she says, I do and do not represent Asian America. So like as an Asian woman, it's really like this positionality is really central to like my like reason in doing this research and kind of like the emotion and care that I have when conducting it. But I can't claim to speak for all Asian women. I can't claim that my research is representative of the opinions of all Asian women. All I can do is essentially show a snapshot of what's out there. And I think that really definitely is how I approached this. So after that, I had all my data and then I sorted it into 3 separate themes that emerged. These themes are representation, desirability, and harm. The second theme is a critique about visibility. And then the third theme is a response to the first two. It's essentially like a call for action in response to like the critiques on desirability and visibility. So I'll be kind of summarizing each theme and then showing like screenshots of the text, because I think like the emotion and like the way that women online have been talking about it is really integral to like how I want to represent them. So the first critique is about representation, desirability, and harm. So in the tweets and TikToks about Asian fishing, what really emerged is that like these Orientalist archetypes of Asian women essentially like act as a basis for violence against them, because they are representative of this way, like represented in this way, like certain individuals feel like that violence against them is like merited, right? And that is, once again, like those representations through Asian fishing are often like sexualized, or like childlike. And I think the hard thing to like read about is a lot of that is like for profit, like non-Asian individuals like represent themselves this way because it's profitable in like the porn industry, specifically. And then for the Atlanta spa shootings, there is a theme about like the construction of this Asian woman as a sexual temptation, which is from the words of the shooter. And that's related back to US militarism. So I'll just go through the pictures of the tweets now. They're a bit long, but I'm just gonna highlight the parts that really stood out to me. So from this person, at MILF Magic on TikTok, Asian fishing is harmful because it perpetuates harmful stereotypes. It's hurtful for white people to try to look like us to perpetuate stereotypes when we get harassed and attacked. And the second one, I think it really talks about like, you know, the desirability of Asian women to white men or white women is not a compliment. That fetishization is not a compliment. As stated here, it is not protection. But yeah, and the next one, this is a tweet about the Atlanta massacre. A lot of people did not make the connection where I said the sexualization of Asian women on social media leads to Atlanta's massacre. The Atlanta murderer targeted Asian spas off the idea that he needed to remove his temptation of Asian women. Asian women are so sexualized that it leads to this type of violent thinking and then violent action. And then the next theme is a critique of the visibility. So for the Asian women that are talking about this, that linkage between representation and violence is very evident to them in their commentary. And like a big frustration that was being expressed over is like, why isn't this being talked about more? Like, why isn't anybody hearing these opinions or seeing it in this light as well? And the main thing that kind of talks about is like this critique of like visibility. So for Asian fishing, when I was looking at the tweets, a lot of the tweets focused on like how like the predominant conversation about Asian fishing is about how like white people are calling out like non-Asian, like Asian people for Asian fishing just because they don't look like a specific way. And that sort of like enforces like the biological essentialism of race, or like that Asian people need to look a specific way, or that, you know, monolids or upturned eyes on other races that happen naturally are offensive and appropriative. And in addition, like this discredit, like there's a talk about like discrediting like Asian women's identities, as we spoke about before, as well as voices, because these conversations happen over the conversations I talked about previously. And with the Atlanta spa shootings, there's this conversation about the fact that it was a sex crime, which is what the police called it, versus Asian women who are identifying as a hate crime because it's visible to them that he shot them because they were Asian women as a sexual temptation, not just because they're like sexual beings. And then also this fear of like invisibility of like, you know, the loss of these women's lives and the loss of their names as well as like this idea of like forgetting, and that, you know, just like that linkage between representation, violence is swept under the rug. There's this fear that their deaths will also be swept under the rug. So this is from one person who was accused of Asian fishing, and they're talking about like, you know, if people want to listen to Asian people, that's great. But if they're not Asian enough for you, then I guess that's too bad. So kind of reinforcing that like white voices are dictating like who is Asian enough to speak on like topics like the Atlanta shooting. And then the next one from Karen Ho on Twitter: people are literally dying, and I worry that it still won't be enough to change things. Do people remember the names of the Asian women who died in Atlanta? Will there be a huge national fundraiser for them? But yeah, and the third theme is kind of like the activism part. So it's the response to these two current critiques. So a big portion of this was the critique of current activism. So kind of like, you know, rejecting the idea of like white saviorism, or like white people coming in to like save Asian people, like save Asian women, like from like Asian fishing or hate crimes. And then also critiques of like the Stop Asian Hate movement, specifically as like being performative in certain aspects, like the lack of action from certain individuals. And there's also like a call for allyship, both in individual action, so like examining biases, making sure that like you're not participating in appropriative trends, or like jokes that reinforce certain like Orientalist or militarist representation. And then as well as systematic action, so addressing like, you know, police, immigration, and so forth. And then also there's like personal activism from Asian diasporic women who are producing research, who are producing literature and music and art to kind of like resist and like rewrite the representations of what it means to be Asian. And I think like a really important part for all of this that really resonated with me is this idea of like emotional labor, is that like it's exhausting to do this, like to have to essentially like re-traumatize yourself, to look at these deaths, to read about them, to look at like racist imagery all the time. It's really exhausting for these women to go through, and for me as well. So these are some quotes. Do you think it's just a coincidence that there's always been these jokes about Asian women at massage parlors and that it's totally unrelated to the shooting? And this like statement of like anti-Asian violence is white violence. And this person, I think this really resonated with me because this is somebody that was doing research and publishing about the Atlanta shootings. But it's like, I'm wondering about the emotional toll that it would take to not only write a trauma, but also translate it into a relevant read for the gaze of white dominant readers. So again, that idea of like critiquing visibility. But yes, we can go to the next one. So this is my thesis that's currently there, and it's kind of like a summary of all of this. But essentially what happens is that the connection between Asian fishing and the Atlanta shootings is that Asian fishing is like a contemporary way of enforcing and perpetuating like the like stereotypes from gendered Orientalism and US militarism that are historical, like in a digital context. And these specific representations is what drive like the physical and sexual violence against Asian women, like in the Atlanta shooting. And the role of Asian women in this like connection is that they can critically identify and voice this visibility and this linkage, and their activism in the digital space is important because it results in like resisting and healing and essentially like creating a future and a present where the lives and voices of Asian women are valued. References, and thank you. I know.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, our final presenter is Paige Love. Paige is a second-year ethnic studies and critical gender studies double major here at UCSD. Growing up in San Francisco, they were brought up in an environment with a rich history of activism and have been involved for the last 6 years. She hopes to use her experiences and her personal struggles with sexuality, gender, and disability to make the world more hospitable to others. She has worked closely with a variety of organizations, most notably with the Miles Hall Foundation and the Friends of Scott and Tawn Hall, who have written and passed AB 988, which will bring a 24/7 non-police response mental health line to the state of California. Please help me in welcoming Paige.
Okay. Hi everyone. So I'm Paige. My project is called COVID Community in Color. Oh my gosh, I can see over there. Okay. UCSD students' experience during the pandemic. So to introduce this, my research question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected students of color? And then more specifically, I'm taking a look at their relationship to university space and community. So at-home communities and student orgs here on campus. My interest is really driven by my experience in COVID. I was a senior to freshman in college, senior in high school to freshman in college, and I experienced everything shutting down as everyone else did. And it really impacted me, as well as within the past year coming into disability, that really has influenced the way I interact with university space and different people here. And then also Professor Wezo, he's right there, he gets a second shout out today. But the decolonizing education class he hosted fall quarter, that really taught me not only what the potential of education is, but what it should be doing for students that it isn't. In terms of importance, I think we all know COVID is really important, and since it's so new, its impacts aren't really fully understood. I don't think they will be for like 50 years. And then in terms of ethnic studies and critical disability studies, I think the legacy of COVID is going to show up in a lot of generational trauma that's really specific to those communities because of the unequal effects of it. For sources of evidence, I'm looking at critical disability theory, which is defined by Melina Hall as a methodology, the theory that involves scrutinizing not bodily or mental impairments, but the social norms that define particular attributes as impairments, as well as the social conditions that concentrate stigmatized attributes in particular populations. So basically, this is a way of studying disability that doesn't look at the ability itself, but the way society constructs it. And I think it's really important to COVID because it also dictates the way in which we are supposed to interact with society, which was then disrupted by COVID itself. And then for COVID-19 research, I looked at a lot of that and I noticed it tended to be very quantitative. A lot of it was in the health and sciences field and it wasn't very intersectional. It would focus on universities alone. people of color alone, or like online classes alone, rather than combining those. And then for socialization, it is the process by which we acquire behaviors, perceptions, values, and see ourselves as part of group. So I've specifically looked at racial ethnic socialization and then online socialization, which are socialization. So for methods, research, and interviews, I first did research, then I reached out, did interviews, and synthesized. For research, I researched those topics that I just talked about, which were critical disability studies, ethnic studies, COVID, and then interview practices. And then I reached out to any clubs on campus that are culturally or ethnically defined. So that would be like the Black Student Union, QTPOC, the Japanese Student Association. And then I conducted a bunch of interviews, but I had to go home because I had a bunch of health problems. So I did them all on Zoom. And instead of doing a bunch of less in-depth interviews, which was my plan, I did 3 really in-depth interviews with different students from different clubs. And I did them all over Zoom while I was home in the Bay. And then for synthesis, I really just put this all together and started to think big picture. How did the transcripts of these interviews connect to the research that I had done earlier? And what themes did I see emerging? In terms of findings, I noticed 3 main themes, one being an outsider-insider dynamic, an in-person transition, and online community. So for that outsider-insider dynamic, there's a couple of parts to it, but essentially UCSD is a predominantly white institution, and a lot of students of color don't feel particularly welcome there. La Jolla also isn't very diverse. So one of my students, they all chose their own names, by the way. So Tofu said that she was missing her home, which was a predominantly Asian community. But on the other hand, students also had these organizations on campus where they could see other kids that looked like them, and that felt like a safe space. So I had another student, Jorge Negro, say that it was, quote, nice to have a place where I can see a plethora of Black students because there's not a lot of us here, and in San Diego in general, we're unicorns. When I see another Black person down here, I get excited. I don't care if they say hi to me, I'm just excited. So they do have those places on campus, and that provided a lot of support for this transition. And then the Academy is also known as a pretty colonial institution. It has a history of only letting in white students and only letting in male students, which excludes students of color and leaves it being very unwelcoming, as well as UCSD's specific history with the military. And then for insider perspectives, again, returning home did provide a lot of these students with a really intense support networks. Tofu especially emphasized that. But they also had these online communities, which were the school organizations. So Houston said that, quote, my friends and family got me through it. FaceTiming or anything made me feel like someone was there. And Tofu said that they felt lonely and unconnected from their friends on campus during COVID. So an in-person transition, students are really excited to be back, but a lot of them are a little more nervous and hesitant to enter these big spaces and really busy campuses. So Tofu specifically talked about how club organizing is a lot harder. It's harder to do things that are big and in person, that are in line with COVID guidelines. And people are a lot more hesitant to go to them now. So they get a higher turnout online than they do in person. And ironically, because all of the old club leadership graduated, these people now, the club leadership presently is much better at organizing online. So they're teaching themselves how to do that again. And then once again, the COVID protocols were a pretty big issue, but they also got to see all these friends that they recognized as like profile pictures before, and they got to meet them in person. Houston said that staying in their bed is tempting because I can just hop on Discord instead of commuting to campus to see people. So there is that dynamic of convenience that has caused a lot of students to hesitate to return to campus. Online community, so like I was just talking about, a lot of students found a lot of friends. A lot of that was the clubs here on campus, but also bigger communities online like Discord, Twitter, Instagram, Zoom. And so those were really crucial relationships. I would say the most crucial during COVID, especially for students who didn't get to return home or were living on their own. One dynamic that I noticed that I did not expect was a certain color blindness in class that kids were talking about, where if they were able to turn off their camera and have a random profile picture and code switch, then they were recognized as white by other students, and they didn't have to do so much heavy lifting and emotional labor during class. So in terms of the conclusion, this project at least helped me really understand the specific and in-depth experiences of students of color at UCSD during COVID. But I think for everyone, It's illuminated their specific needs here, and also I think it helps predict the future trajectory of students of color. And so in terms of those needs, we need increased mental health capacity. A lot of people have been complaining about CAPS and how it needs more money and it can't provide enough. Especially it doesn't have a lot of therapists or staff who are really trained to handle things like racial trauma. And then we need more student of color specific financial aid. We have those scholarships every once in a while, but you need a lot more of it considering the economic impacts of COVID. And then increased funding for cultural organizations. These, if anything, are what I think got students through this. And like everyone was talking about earlier, all the projects touched on it. We don't have a particularly out there or visible student activism scene, and putting a lot more energy into that would provide students with more visible support networks. In terms of implication or the fallouts of COVID, I think we'll be seeing this for a very long time through generational trauma, especially in marginalized communities that were impacted more, and social anxiety if people don't re-socialize very well. And then I do think positively we'll see online in-person flexibility, which is something that people who are disabled have been asking for a very long time, but also helps people who have like a caretaker role at home or work and do school. And I think although ethnic studies and marginalized people have known this for a very long time, catastrophes have unequal effects. I think this really reached the global scheme and became a less controversial statement during COVID. It finally clicked for a lot of people. And so hopefully this will translate into more aid for people when this happens in the future. And then in terms of future research, longitudinal studies, which are basically studies over a long time with the same people, on social, emotional, and economic impacts of COVID, having them be comparative across identities too, would be super interesting. So you could see how different people were differently affected over something like 40 years. And then ethnic studies research, I think it would be really interesting to see some research on internet usage in communities of color online, because there are a lot of them that I didn't know about that like the students brought up to me, even ones that aren't club specific. And then on college students, especially ethnic studies majors, because there's not a lot of us. And I think it would be really interesting to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is perfect because we were supposed to do the Q&A. I don't know if we have time for that.
I tried to go fast and make up
Yeah,
for it.
I think you guys have it at least until 4:15, so maybe we can have some time for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions. They're welcome to have the. If not, we can end it here. Oh, there's, okay.
It's not a question, I just want to compliment everyone on like really unique presentation
Yes.
styles, like it really, your personalities really came across in your presentation. You went through like a lot of information, and I was engaged the entire time, so
Yeah.
shout out to that.
Yeah. Congratulations, you guys. We're so proud of you. Yeah, if there's no questions, we can all head to. Yeah. Yes, and please stay, yeah, of course. Please stay for the graduation. You know.
You can stay for graduation, there's something that
Do you want to take your reflection? And that's yours. I'm gonna take my little boy.
You want me to put that in your box?
Sure, yeah.